The White Feather. The cattle car's doors groaned open, and Senior Lieutenant Fyodor Volkov stepped into the pale December light of Stalag 7A, his boots crunching on frozen mud. The morning mist clung to the Bavarian countryside like cigarette smoke in a closed room, carrying the scent of wood fires and something else. Bread, real bread, baking somewhere beyond the wire. 3 weeks had passed since his capture south of Leningrad, where the Krasnoye Selo Ridge had finally fallen to German counterattacks. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent 17 confirmed kills on that ridge, earning his nickname White Feather, not for any plume, but for his unsettling patience, the way he could remain motionless for hours like fresh snow on a windowsill. Now he moved in a shuffling column of Soviet prisoners, their breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. "Schnell! Schnell!" barked the guards, but without the vicious edge Volkov expected. They looked tired, these Wehrmacht soldiers, older than the eager faces he'd seen through his SVT-40 scope. One guard, a weathered Bavarian with sergeant's stripes, actually steadied an older prisoner who stumbled. The camp unfolded before them with startling organization. Neat barracks rows, a central parade ground, even a small chapel with a wooden cross. This wasn't the hellscape described in Soviet briefings. Where were the torture chambers? The starvation compounds? Instead, Volkov saw prisoners moving about work details, some wearing thick coats, others carrying what looked like letters. Senior Sergeant Pavel Morozov fell into step beside him, the Order of Lenin recipient, still maintaining military bearing despite their circumstances. Morozov had been Volkov's harshest critic back at the 45th Guards Regiment, dismissing his unconventional sniper techniques. "This is a trick, Fedya," Morozov whispered. "They fatten us before the slaughter. Don't believe what you see." But Volkov was already seeing too much. A German guard shared his cigarette with a French prisoner. A Polish officer walked freely to the infirmary, unescorted. Most unsettling of all, the smell of hot soup drifted from what could only be a prisoner mess hall. The intake processing was efficient, almost courteous. Forms in multiple languages. A German medical officer, Dr. Heinrich Weber, who spoke careful Russian and seemed genuinely concerned about frostbite among the new arrivals. When Weber noticed Volkov favoring his left foot, injured during capture, he made a note with unexpected gentleness. "You will rest that ankle, yes?" he said in accented Russian. "War is hard enough without limping." That evening in Barracks 12, Volkov lay on his straw mattress staring at the ceiling. Outside, he could hear guards laughing with prisoners about something, their voices carrying through the thin walls. Inside his head, two truths wrestled like fighting dogs. Everything he'd been taught about German brutality, everything his eyes had shown him in one day. Morozov's voice cut through the darkness. "Remember who we are, Fedya. Remember what they did to our homeland. This comfort is their weapon against our souls." But when Volkov closed his eyes, he saw Dr. Weber's genuine concern, heard the guard's patient German as he helped the stumbling prisoner, and he smelled that bread again, rich and warm, like the loaves his grandmother baked in Tula before the revolution. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How does a man choose between what he was taught and what his own eyes tell him? The routine of Stalag 7 unfolded over the following days like a careful choreography. Réveillé at 0600, roll call in the central yard, work assignments by 0800. Volkov found himself assigned to the camp workshop, repairing furniture alongside a mixed group of French, Polish and Russian prisoners under the supervision of Obergefreiter Klaus Weber, cousin, it turned out, to the camp's medical officer. Klaus Weber had served on the Eastern Front before a shrapnel wound to his right shoulder earned him this rear echelon posting. He spoke broken Russian learned during his service around Smolensk, and he approached his guard duties with the weary professionalism of a man who'd seen too much. "My cousin Heinrich says you were sniper," Weber said to Volkov one morning, watching him carefully sand a chair leg. Good shot, yes? He gestured toward his wounded shoulder. Maybe we met before, different circumstances. The comment hung in the workshop air like sawdust. Volkov had indeed operated around Smolensk the previous winter. Had his crosshairs ever found this man's shoulder? The possibility created an uncomfortable intimacy, a shared geography of violence, neither acknowledged directly. More unsettling was the work itself. The furniture they repaired wasn't for German use. It went to bombed-out civilians in nearby Moosburg. French prisoner Marcel Dubois, a carpenter from Lyon, explained while teaching Volkov proper wood-joining techniques. The Herr Obergefreiter, he has sister in the town, Marcel said in careful Russian. Her house. The RAF bombed it. We fix her table, her chairs. Strange war, non. During lunch breaks, Volkov observed the camp's peculiar ecosystem. Red Cross packages arrived weekly, distributed fairly among all prisoners regardless of nationality. The library contained books in 6 languages. Prisoners organized evening classes, French conversation, Polish literature, even basic German for those who wanted to learn. Most disturbing to his Soviet training was the camp canteen, where prisoners could purchase small luxuries with scrip earned through work. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, even small bottles of beer on Sundays. Volkov watched German guards and Allied prisoners negotiate trades, tobacco for photographs, letters for soap, with the casual familiarity of market vendors. Morozov refused to participate in any of it. He ate only official rations, declined Red Cross parcels, and spent his evenings writing what he claimed were reports for future Soviet intelligence. His rigid adherence to ideological purity drew admiration from some Russian prisoners and eye rolls from others. "You think kindness changes anything?" Morozov demanded during one of their evening arguments. "They smile while they enslave our homeland. This comfort is poison for weak minds." But late at night, when Morozov thought no one was watching, Volkov saw him reading a German novel from the library, his lips moving silently as he worked through the foreign words. The first letter from home arrived in mid-December, carried by a new transport from the Eastern Front. Volkov's hands shook as he recognized his wife Katerina's careful script. She wrote of rationed bread in Tula, of winter cold, of their daughter Anya learning to read. She asked if he was fed, if he was warm, if the Germans were treating him according to international law. How could he explain that he was warmer and better fed than many civilians back home? That his German guard had given him extra wool socks without being asked? That he was learning carpentry skills that might prove useful after the war? That night, he dreamed of the Krasnoye Selo Ridge, of patient hours in shell craters, of the methodical precision of 17 confirmed kills. But in the dream, the faces in his scope belonged to Klaus Weber, to Dr. Heinrich, to guards who shared cigarettes and worried about frostbite. What kind of enemy offers chocolate and teaches woodworking? The package arrived with the January transport, wrapped in brown paper and bearing the careful handwriting of Volkov's wife, Katerina. Inside, beneath letters from home and a small photograph of his daughter Anya, lay something that made his breath catch. A tin of Russian black tea, somehow procured despite the siege conditions around Tula. Tea had been their ritual during his sniper training, those patient hours learning to read wind and distance. His instructor, an old veteran named Dmitri, had always brewed tea between lessons, claiming it taught patience better than any manual. "The rifle was never the problem, Fedya," the old man had said. "The problem is our impatience. Good hunters wait for the right moment." Now, holding the precious tin in Stalag 7A's morning light, Volkov felt the weight of memory and contradiction. The German guards had allowed the package through intact, even though tea was surely a luxury they could have confiscated. Obergefreiter Weber had actually helped him understand the customs declaration, translating the German forms with patient care. Morozov watched from his bunk, his expression darkening. "They let you keep it because it serves their purpose." Every small kindness weakens your resolve. When we return home, what will you tell the commissars? That the fascists gave you tea and therefore deserve mercy. The question struck deep. Already, Volkov found himself thinking of his captors as individuals rather than enemies. Dr. Heinrich Weber, who treated Soviet prisoners with the same care as Germans. Klaus Weber, who shared stories of his farm in Bavaria and worried aloud about spring planting. Even Hauptmann Müller, the camp commandant, who had personally investigated reports of a guard stealing from Red Cross packages. That afternoon brought news that changed everything. A new transport arrived from the Eastern Front, carrying prisoners from the Leningrad sector. Among them, Private Alexei Petrov, barely 18, who had been captured during the same offensive where Volkov fell. Senior Lieutenant, Petrov whispered urgently during evening meal. I bring news from Colonel Kuznetsov. The ridge, sir. Krasnoye Selo. Volkov's hand stilled on his spoon. The soup, thick potato with real meat, suddenly tasted like ash. 3 days after your capture, sir. Soviet forces retook the ridge without firing a shot. The Germans abandoned positions they'd held for months. Word came down from regimental command that a single sniper's patience had achieved what 3 battalion assaults could not. The irony cut deep. His capture had become a victory. His absence had somehow completed his mission. 17 confirmed kills had terrorized the German defenders enough that they'd withdrawn rather than face the phantom sniper again. But here he sat, eating their soup, learning their language, watching Klaus Weber teach a Polish prisoner how to carve wooden toys for his children. That night, Volkov brewed his precious Russian tea using hot water begged from the camp kitchen. The ritual felt like betrayal and remembrance both. Dr. Heinrich Weber happened to pass during evening rounds, drawn by the unfamiliar aroma. Russian tea? The doctor asked, his face brightening with genuine interest. My grandfather served in St. Petersburg before the Great War. He spoke often of Russian hospitality, the tea ceremonies. Before Volkov could think, he found himself offering the doctor a cup. Weber accepted with surprised gratitude, and they sat in comfortable silence, sharing tea and watching snow fall beyond the wire. For a moment, prisoner and captor disappeared, leaving only 2 men warming themselves against winter's bite. When Weber left, Morozov materialized from the shadows like an accusing ghost. Now you share our homeland's gifts with the invaders. What comes next, Fedya? Will you teach him Russian songs? Tell him stories of your childhood in Tula? The worst part was that Volkov could imagine doing exactly that. The tea had created an intimacy that transcended uniform and wire. In Dr. Weber's appreciation for the black tea's bitter warmth, Volkov had glimpsed something uncomfortably human. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Can a man betray his country by acknowledging his enemy's humanity? February brought the first signs of spring to the Bavarian countryside, and with it, an unexpected request. Doctor, Heinrich Weber approached Volkov during sick call, where the sniper had been receiving treatment for persistent ankle pain. Your carpentry work is excellent, Weber said in his careful Russian. The local pastor asks if you might help repair the village church. Bombing damage, you understand. Very old building requires skilled hands. The request seemed impossible. Leave the camp, work in the town of Moosburg itself. But Weber explained the arrangement. Selected prisoners could participate in work details beyond the wire, under minimal guard, provided they gave their word not to attempt escape. Parole, Weber called it, using the French term. Your word as an officer and gentleman. Morozov's reaction was volcanic. This is how it begins. First tea, then work, then collaboration. You'll return from their village speaking German and thinking their thoughts. Mark my words, Fedya. This path leads to the penal battalions when we reach home. But Volkov found himself accepting. Not from any desire to collaborate, he told himself, but from curiosity about the world beyond the wire. What did a German village look like? How did civilians react to enemy prisoners walking among them? The reality proved more complex than any propaganda could capture. Moosburg had been touched by war, but not broken. RAF bombers had hit the rail junction twice, leaving gaps in the medieval church's roof and shattering several stained glass windows. But daily life continued, women queuing for rationed bread, children playing in streets, old men tending small gardens despite the lingering snow. The church itself was ancient, its stones worn smooth by centuries of Bavarian winters. Pastor Wilhelm Hoffmann was a gentleman in his 70s who spoke excellent Russian, learned during missionary work in Odessa before the revolution. "War damages more than buildings," he said, while showing Volkov the broken woodwork. "It wounds the soul. Perhaps in repairing what is broken, we repair something in ourselves." Working alongside two German civilians, a master carpenter named Johann and his apprentice son Kurt, Volkov discovered the peculiar intimacy of shared craft. They communicated through gesture and example, measuring twice, cutting once, finding satisfaction in work well done. Johann had lost his eldest son at Stalingrad. Kurt worried constantly about being called up when he turned 18. Yet they worked together, these supposed enemies, restoring beauty to a place of prayer. When Volkov demonstrated a particular joinery technique learned from the French prisoner Marcel, Johann nodded with professional appreciation. "Gut, sehr gut," the old carpenter murmured. "Skill recognizes skill regardless of uniform." The most unsettling moment came when little Anna Hoffmann, the pastor's 6-year-old granddaughter, brought them afternoon coffee and stared at Volkov with frank curiosity. "Are you really a Russian?" she asked in simple German that Volkov was beginning to understand. "Papa says Russians are just people like us, only they speak differently. How do you explain war to a child whose grandfather believes enemies are simply neighbors who haven't met yet?" During the walk back to camp, Klaus Weber matched Volkov's pace, both men comfortable in the silence of a winter afternoon. Finally, the guard spoke. "My cousin says you ask many questions about German military doctrine during your medical visits. Professional curiosity, perhaps?" The observation was gentle, but pointed. Volkov realized he had been gathering intelligence almost unconsciously. Troop movements, supply conditions, morale assessments. Old habits of a sniper's mind, cataloging details that might prove useful. "Old habits," he admitted. "Yeah, old habits." Weber smiled without malice. "I still scan rooflines when I hear aircraft, even though I'm far from the front. What changes how we see the world, nicht wahr?" That evening, Volkov wrote his first honest letter home, trying to explain the complexity of his situation without triggering censorship concerns. How could he tell Katerina that his German doctor cared more for his ankle than some Soviet field medics had? That enemy civilians trusted him with their damaged church? That a 6-year-old girl saw him as just another person who happened to speak differently? Morozov watched him write, his silence more accusatory than any words. Later, lying in the darkness of Barracks 12, Volkov fingered the small piece of ancient wood that Pastor Hoffmann had let him keep, a fragment from the church's original construction, centuries old, worn smooth by countless hands. Like his tin of Russian tea, it had become a talisman bridging two worlds, but unlike the tea, which spoke of home and memory, this wood whispered of something harder to name, the possibility that enemies might not be enemies forever. What happens when the line between us and them begins to blur? The revelation came in March, during what should have been a routine medical examination. Dr. Heinrich Weber was checking Volkov's ankle, which had healed remarkably well under his care, when a folder slipped from his medical bag, papers scattered across the floor of the infirmary, and as both men bent to collect them, Volkov glimpsed something that stopped his heart. Official Wehrmacht medical reports. Dozens of them, each documenting injuries, illnesses, and treatment protocols for Soviet prisoners. But these weren't the sanitized records meant for Red Cross inspections. These were Dr. Weber's private notes, written in careful German script, chronicling individual cases with an attention to detail that spoke of deep professional concern. Prisoner 4847, Senior Lieutenant F. Volkov, read one entry that Volkov managed to scan before Weber quickly gathered the papers. Ankle injury healing well. Patient shows signs of severe psychological stress, common among captured snipers. Recommend continued therapy through meaningful work. Note, prisoner demonstrates exceptional skill in carpentry, suggests pre-war civilian training. Individual responds well to dignity and respect. Weber noticed Volkov's strained expression as they both straightened. You read German better than you pretend, the doctor said quietly. What did you see? The moment stretched between them, heavy with implication. Finally, Volkov answered in halting German. Sie schreiben über uns wie Menschen. You write about us like people. Weber's face flushed slightly. What else should I write? That you are animals, monsters. I am doctor first, German second. The Hippocratic Oath recognizes no nationality. That evening, unable to contain what he'd discovered, Volkov sought out Klaus Weber at the guard station. The Obergefreiter was writing his own report, daily logs required by camp administration, and looked up with mild surprise at the approaching prisoner. I need to ask you something, Volkov said in German that was improving daily. Your cousin's medical files. He writes about us like we matter, like we're not just numbers. Klaus set down his pen, studying Volkov's face in the lamplight. What do you think we are, then? You, me, the French, the Poles? I thought I knew. Before this place, I thought I knew exactly who was good and who was evil. And now? Volkov gestured toward the camp around them, where French prisoners were teaching German guards how to play chess, where Polish officers shared Red Cross packages with German medics, where children from Moosburg brought hand-drawn pictures to prisoners working in the village. Now I think war makes us all into something we weren't meant to be. Klaus nodded slowly. My cousin keeps those detailed files because he believes someone, someday, will ask what really happened in places like this. Not the official version, not the propaganda from either side. The truth about how people treated each other when the world was burning. The next morning brought a crisis that would test everything Volkov had learned about the complex humanity of his captors. During routine inspection, Hauptmann Möller discovered that Morozov had been keeping a detailed intelligence journal, cataloguing guard rotations, defensive positions, even personal information about German staff members. Möller was furious, his professional face cracking to reveal genuine betrayal. We have treated you with honor, according to Geneva Convention, and you repay this with espionage. The entire Russian prisoner contingent was placed under enhanced security. Work details outside the camp were suspended. Red Cross privileges were restricted. The careful ecosystem of mutual respect that had developed over months began to crumble. But the real shock came when Morozov was called before the camp tribunal. As senior Soviet prisoner, Volkov was required to attend as a witness. There, spread across Müller's desk, were pages from Morozov's journal, not just intelligence reports, but bitter assessments of fellow prisoners. Volkov shows dangerous signs of Stockholm Syndrome, read one entry. Recommends for investigation by SMERSH upon repatriation. Has shared Russian tea with German medical officer. Participated enthusiastically in civilian work details. Demonstrates concerning familiarity with German language and customs. Morozov sat rigid as his words were read aloud, his eyes never meeting Volkov's. Every kindness observed, every human moment shared, every crack in ideological armor, all carefully documented for future retribution. Dr. Weber, present as the camp's senior medical officer, listened with growing distress. When the reading concluded, he spoke quietly to Müller in rapid German. Then, turning to Volkov, he said, I want you to know that my medical files will remain confidential. Whatever your comrade believes about dignity and respect, I believe these are not weaknesses, but necessities for survival. When this war ends, some of us must remember that we remained human. That night, Volkov sat in the darkness of Barracks 12, holding his fragment of ancient church wood and his tin of Russian tea. Two talismans representing two loyalties that could no longer coexist peacefully. Outside, spring rain drummed against the roof, washing the last snow from the Bavarian hills where he had learned that enemies could be friends, that kindness could be a form of resistance, and that the hardest battles were fought not against foreign armies, but against the certainty of one's own righteousness. How do you choose between loyalty to ideology and loyalty to truth? The repatriation order came in late April 1945, delivered by Soviet officers who arrived at Stalag 70 with the grim efficiency of bureaucrats processing damaged goods. Senior Lieutenant Volkov stood in the camp's central yard alongside hundreds of other Soviet prisoners, watching their liberators with a mixture of relief and dread. Major Alexei Romanov, the SMERSH counterintelligence officer, studied the assembled prisoners with cold professional assessment. Behind him, clerks prepared forms, questionnaires, and preliminary interrogation schedules. The questions would be thorough. How were you captured? Why did you survive when others died? What did you tell the enemy? What did they give you in return? Dr. Heinrich Weber moved through the crowd, conducting final medical examinations for prisoners' repatriation records. When he reached Volkov, he pressed a small envelope into the sniper's palm. "Your medical file," he said quietly in Russian. "The complete version. Someone should remember what really happened here." Their eyes met briefly, acknowledging what both knew. Volkov might need proof of medical treatment to explain his survival and apparent health. In Soviet repatriation camps, returning too well-fed or well-dressed could itself be viewed as collaboration. Klaus Weber appeared as Volkov gathered his few possessions. The Obergefreiter carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "From Pastor Hoffman and little Anna," he said. "They wanted you to have this." Inside was the wooden cross from the church they had repaired together, carved from the same ancient timber as Volkov's small fragment. A note in the pastor's careful script read, "For a craftsman who understands that restoration is possible even after destruction." Senior Sergeant Morozov approached, flanked by two SMERSH officers who treated him with the respect due a patriotic prisoner who had maintained ideological purity. His intelligence journal would be valuable for prosecuting collaborators and identifying security risks among returning prisoners. "Fedya," Morozov said, his voice carrying both warning and genuine concern, "remember who you are. Remember what you owe to those who never surrendered." The trucks arrived at noon, American military vehicles driven by Soviet personnel. As prisoners loaded their possessions, Volkov made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He buried the wooden cross deep in his pack, but left the tin of Russian tea on his bunk, a gesture that Dr. Weber would understand when he discovered it during final inspection. The tea would remain at Stalag 70, brewing in the memory of shared warmth between enemies. But the church wood would travel east, carrying its testament to the possibility of rebuilding what war had broken. The journey home took 3 weeks, through devastated landscapes where cities had been reduced to rubble, and hope existed only in the determined faces of civilians planting gardens among ruins. At each stop, Soviet officials conducted preliminary interrogations, separating prisoners into categories: heroes, survivors, and suspects. Volkov's sniper record and circumstantial capture protected him from immediate suspicion, but he sensed the careful attention of security officers, cataloging details for future investigation. He answered questions with mechanical precision, revealing nothing of tea shared with German doctors or wooden crosses carved with enemy civilians. The final irony awaited him in Moscow, where military historians debriefed returning officers about tactical intelligence. Colonel Kuznetsov himself conducted Volkov's session, eager to understand how a single sniper had paralyzed an entire German defensive position. "Your technique with the SVT-40 was revolutionary," the colonel explained. "Military academies are already incorporating your methods into training curricula. Patient micro-positioning, calculated psychological pressure, understanding time differently than your enemy. These concepts will influence sniper doctrine for generations." But when Kuznetsov asked about conditions in German captivity, Volkov found himself describing a sanitized version of Stalag 7A, adequate rations distributed fairly, medical care according to Geneva Convention, German guards maintaining professional distance. No mention of shared tea or village churches or 6-year-old girls who saw Russians as people. Years later, after Stalin's death and the gradual thaw of Soviet paranoia, Volkov would sometimes touch the wooden fragment hidden in his workshop and remember Dr. Weber's words about remaining human. He became a master carpenter in Tula, teaching young apprentices that patience and precision could create beauty from raw materials. He never spoke publicly about the complexity of his German captivity, never corrected the official narrative of brutal enemies and patriotic resistance. But on quiet evenings, when grandchildren asked about the war, he would brew strong black tea and tell them that the hardest lesson of any conflict was learning to see enemies as people, and that this knowledge was both a burden and a gift. The wooden cross now serves as a bookmark in his grandson's carpentry manual, carrying its ancient wisdom into another generation. That even in humanity's darkest hours, someone always chooses to build rather than destroy. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who forces you to question what you thought you knew about good and evil. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. In the end, what breaks us more, hatred or unexpected kindness?